Boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos. Sejam bem-vindos. Mais um encontro do Tiaços, em clima de véspera de eleição no Brasil. Momentos difíceis aqui no Brasil, momentos tensos, momentos difíceis, momentos de tensão, mas também momentos de esperança. Nos aguardemos até domingo. Hoje, a gente vai trazer a analista junguiana Helen Morgan. Helen, prazer te receber. Queria te pedir desculpas por não ter te recebido antes. Estava terminando o seminário, mas eu tenho certeza que a Isa e a Luciana Ximenes fizeram as honras da casa e as regras da hospitalidade com você. Vou apresentar a Helen. Helen Morgan, ela é membro da British Psychotherapy Foundation, analista de data e supervisora da Associação Junguiana Analítica da Inglaterra. Sua formação inclui experiências em comunidades terapêuticas com adolescentes e em saúde mental de adultos. Ela foi presidente da Associação Britânica de Psicoterapeutas de 2004 a 2008 e presidente do Conselho Psicanalítico Britânico de 2015 a 2018. Publicou inúmeros artigos, incluindo vários sobre racismo. E seu livro, O Trabalho da Branquitude, uma perspectiva psicanalítica, foi publicado na primavera de 2021 pela Routledge. Helen, bem-vindo ao Tiaços. É um grande prazer em te receber. Eu consegui terminar de ler o seu... Esse é o livro da Helen, Trabalho sobre a Branquitude, né? Livro excelente e que traz muitas questões relevantes à nossa realidade social brasileira, né? Até trouxe como curiosidade, Helen, um livro de uma autora brasileira chamada O Pacto da Branquitude, que usa a mesma expressão. Então, esse é um tema que está na pauta da política brasileira, da cultura brasileira, de uma reimaginação mesmo das minorias, do lugar do negro na cultura. Então, sua palestra é muito bem-vinda. Queria mostrar também esse livro que a Helen lançou com a Fanny Browster, Legados Raciais, Jung, Política e Cultura. Helen, a Fanny esteve conosco aqui ano passado, no Tiaços. Também foi uma ótima experiência. Não sei se ela conversou contigo ou não, mas eu acho que o convite para você falar completa um ciclo desse tema tão caro a nós, né? Racismo, branquitude, desigualdades raciais, preconceitos, temas que agora vieram à tona dentro da comunidade junguiana, e me parece que a Fanny e você são as melhores expoentes desse pensamento. Obrigado pela tua participação, sinta-se bem-vinda, a palavra é sua.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Lisa, can you hear me all right? Just to say, this isn't going to be a very Jungian presentation, I'm afraid. I do write about Jung in the book, but I'm not focusing so much on Jungian thought today, but we may take it there. Just to also say, the whole world is watching your election this weekend, so we're very interested in what's happening in Brazil for obvious reasons. I want to start by reminding everyone of the title of the talk, Whiteness, a Problem for Our Times. The focus throughout is on whiteness as both a construction and a lived experience. And I argue that it is indeed a very real problem. For people of colour, certainly, but also for white folk. In the Western world, whiteness is regarded as the default position, the norm, and hence difficult to see, and has only become a matter for inquiry relatively recently. For many of us who identify as white, such an examination can be a new and sometimes uncomfortable experience, and it is understandable that we seek ways of defending ourselves against what can be experienced as accusation. Today, I want to offer some thoughts and ideas on the matter, and I invite those present who see yourselves and are seen by others as white to stay as open as possible to the images, feelings, and thoughts that arise in your mind as you listen. I am also aware I'm speaking from a British perspective, where we have a long and troubled history as a colonial power and running and profiting from the slave trade, but where we didn't have chattel slavery on our own soil. This will give a different perspective from a Brazilian one at times, which perhaps we can discuss. It is a subject where we need to engage thought and feeling, but also imagination. So in order to help that process, I'm going to use images throughout, and I hope you find them helpful. And now I just need to share screen. Is that coming up? All right. Okay. The talk is divided into 3 parts: a general discussion about whiteness, its history and its meaning, the concept of whiteness in relation to child development, how whiteness is learned, and some thoughts on what work we might do to bring about change. The concept of whiteness as applied to humans is full of paradox and contradiction. No human being, even the fairest amongst us, has skin that is actually white, just as the darkest is not black. Yet this crude form of colour coding, which came into being in the modern era, has divided humanity and ensured white supremacy in the service of domination, colonialism, slavery, and capitalism. The deliberate use of this division for political and economic advantage was first recorded in 17th century Virginia, when the first Africans were forcibly brought on slave ships to work the plantations. Anxious that the indentured European labour force would find common cause with the enslaved Africans, the term white was used to transform the masters, plantation owners, and European labourers into one all-inclusive group. Through a set of laws that privileged whites alone, any class solidarity with the blacks was disrupted, ensuring that power remained in the hands of the ruling white elite. Gathering all those with lighter hued skin within the rubric white, in the emergent piecemeal way that this occurred, not only allowed the illusion of common privilege, but also tapped into our unconscious imagery in relation to white and to black. These associations, albeit with some local variations, tend to be universal, based as they are in the nature of our bodies and the diurnal rhythms of the planet we inhabit. Mother's nourishing milk and father's productive sperm are white. Bile and shit are black or brown. White is associated with daytime, the dove of peace, and the pure soul, whereas black belongs to the dark terrors of night, to war and sin. Devils inhabit the blackness of hell, and angels the whiteness of heaven. Link those with a lighter hue of skin to whiteness, and the others to blackness, and much of the psychological work of justifying domination is done. Whiteness implies purity and allows no contamination, no tincture, or it ceases to be white. We are whitewashed, drained of our colours, and all perfections are located elsewhere. The creation of whiteness forces blackness into existence and turns distinctions of shades into oppositions. Since white cannot allow darkness to exist within itself, shadows must be rejected, and cast into what it deems to be black. In the words of James Hillman, white casts its own white shadow. This conclusion may be better to say, white sees his own shadow in black, not because they are inherently opposite, but it is archetypally given to whiteness to imagine in oppositions. Sorry. The category of whiteness, like that of blackness, includes within it an infinite variety of lived experience of and relationships to the concept. The line that is drawn separating the two has shifted across history and geography, leaving behind a variety of legacies. Many here today will have ancestors who themselves were oppressed and discriminated against. A person of Irish, Southern European, Eastern European, or Latin American descent, or those who are Jewish, Muslim, or from minority ethnic groups, will have their own historic background of suffering and oppression. Indeed, there have been periods and times and places when each of these groups have been designated as non-white or black. Those who have grown up in societies with a colonial history carry a different collective cultural shadow than those who haven't. Some countries have experienced high levels of immigration from previous colonies, and others hardly any at all, so that their white citizens have had little direct experience of living within a diverse population. The existence of the plantations and of institutionalized chattel slavery for several hundred years in the Americas leaves a different legacy than that inherited by the descendants of the European men who ran the trade. Few of us perhaps trace a direct hereditary line back to slavers, yet here in the UK, we live our lives amongst the concrete legacy and profits of that trade. There are also political and ethical differences within the white group. Some experience discrimination on the basis of gender, class, sexuality, language, disability, etc. These personal histories and experiences are important and to be honoured, and it is for each individual to find their own relationship. And yet, whatever our personal history, wherever we were born, into which class, however young or old, if we walk the world as white, we inherit an advantage denied those regarded as black. The term white privilege, whilst important, is also, I believe, problematic, and that it can be taken sometimes defensively as a denial of the very real deprivations, monetary, physical, and emotional, that some white people clearly suffer. Many white people have to bear the results of discrimination due to class or sexuality or gender or disability. Nevertheless, we do so without the added burden of having to experience the daily grind and violence of racism. I don't have the equivalent statistics for Brazil, but in the UK, black people are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white people, and black infant mortality is twice as high. Black people are twice as likely as white people to be unemployed, and almost half of black households live in poverty. Black people are 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people, and 4 times more likely to be arrested. They constitute 3% of the population, but 8% of deaths in police custody. We who are white do not fear the forces of law and order in the way a black person does. Doors are not closed to us because of our skin colour. We see ourselves reflected in places of power and influence and can take for granted a basic social justice across all our institutions, from health to education to the law. We may, if we wish, remain disinterested in racism itself, and have the choice to ignore or even deny its presence in the world we inhabit. It is the fact that we are not disadvantaged in these ways, that Black people are, that leads me to stay with the term white privilege for the purpose of this essay. Facing the implications of being white is not comfortable, and we can seek ways of delinking ourselves from this phenomenon, often through a form of exceptionalism. I echo Robin DiAngelo's plea in her book on white fragility, that when we face our whiteness, we need to set aside our sense of uniqueness. This, she says, is a critical skill that will allow you to see the big picture of the society in which we live. Individualism will not. For now, try to let go of your individual narrative and grapple with the collective messages we all receive as members of a larger shared culture. Work to see how these messages have shaped your life, rather than use some aspect of your story to excuse yourself from their impact. It can be argued that the very use of the concepts white and black is a way of perpetuating a false binary, and they need to be dropped. It would indeed be a great achievement if we were to reach a point where such terms became meaningless. But that seems a painfully long way away. In the meantime, I argue that to deny the terms is to deny the reality of a form of classification and injustice which needs to be faced at an individual and collective level if we are to get anywhere with creating a fairer, kinder society. Such a denial offers a shortcut that avoids such work and reflects and reinforces the tendency we white people have to not see either our whiteness or our racism, perhaps best summarized as a colorblind position. From the evidence that has emerged from the analysis of DNA, it is now clear that the term race is a constructed concept with no objective basis in biology. The divisions of the races was created for economic and political purposes, and it is a deep, entrenched social structure which creates and promotes white advantage and is one within which we all live. No one can be free from it. The statement, "I am not a racist," is meaningless in such a system. This awareness of the deeply embedded aspect of the racist system is essential if we are to get anywhere with understanding and changing it. Linda Ulkoff writes, "Whiteness is lived and not merely represented. It is a prominent feature of one's way of being in the world, of how one navigates that world, and how one is navigated around by others." She goes on to suggest that we tend to reject group concepts in order to maintain the idea that we have control over our identity. She says, being identified in a way that lies beyond our individual control conflicts with individualist ideas and delusions about our autonomy. The real concern with race may be less the faulty presumptions about genetic difference than the fact that this is a social fact about us, with social meanings and implications over which we have limited agency. People of colour have largely come to accept this. For whites, the forcible interpolations of their racial identity are more often a new experience. As Adrian Harris puts it, to turn to a deconstruction of whiteness is to make the unremarkable remarkable, to force unexamined assumptions, to open up a set of questions. The goal, of course, is to see whiteness as a social construction, to see that whiteness is the unmarked category, and in that particular way accrues and hoards power. Psychoanalytic understandings of how racism operates, focusing as they do on the dynamics of splitting, projection, and interjection, whilst useful to an extent, tend to reinforce the individualism that liberal white people prefer, as Ulkoff describes. We are more comfortable thinking in terms of the individual racist act which we can then condemn and dissociate ourselves from. I think, therefore, that we need to apply our usual tools and interpretations with care, acknowledge the limitation and possible defensiveness of our theories on this matter, and include the perspectives that come from other more socially oriented disciplines, such as psychosocial studies, philosophy, political theory, etc. In his explorations of the archetypal uses of whiteness, Hillman points out that the concept also implies attributes that are not so positive. White also represents what is ashen, pallid, colourless, blank, lily-livered, cowardly. He also writes of white as but a blank and ignorant page, the requisite stupidity at the start. The philosopher Charles Mill refers to the inverted epistemology he calls white ignorance, which he suggests produces the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves create. Olkoff describes this concept as a set of substantive epistemic practices designed to protect their belief that society is basically a meritocracy, people of colour are responsible for their troubles, and racism is a thing of the past. This concept of white ignorance seems to me to link with Bion's concept of -K, a link I explore a little in my book. Just as D'Angelo stresses that white fragility is not a weakness, but a way of protecting white advantage, white ignorance is the means by which we at the centre close our eyes to our privilege and the impact on those at the margins. By staying blind and unknowing, by assuming racism, disparity, and prejudice belong to the past or to other individuals, we manage the tightrope of relieving ourselves of guilt whilst ensuring the advantages of our whiteness are maintained. We, who I refer to as white liberals, can dwell in this ignorance. Our racism is of a cordial variety, which conceals the violence within, which we project into avowed white supremacies, failing to see how we are linked. Martin Luther King wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his strike towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice." The ugliness of racism needs challenging by white people and recognizing that we will have to what we will have to relinquish in assuring a healthy society. My argument is that we too have much to gain in doing so. Liberal is not only an ironic term, but includes within it a longing for justice and equality, and it is those instincts we need to call upon. As Cavell writes, racism which diminishes its subject to non-human status also diminishes its perpetrator. All are losers by its terms. It does so in the final analysis by diminishing life, by reducing it to an abstraction, the better to manage it historically. And racism thereby becomes part of the wider problem of man's compact with the natural world in which he finds himself. When we white folk choose to stay blind, deaf, and silent concerning our own privilege and its impact on the Black other, we are opting to remain unconscious of a crucial aspect of our lives and of ourselves. This part of our shadow has been whitewashed out of view, but then what colours, what potential, what depth might we be missing? Given this, why do we persist in tolerating this lack, which seems so central to whiteness? How do we manage so effectively to persevere in not seeing the implications for the society of which we are citizens? Why do we continue so doggedly with our ignorance? The tenacity of the problem suggests the political and the social has developed roots deep into the individual psyche, and it made me wonder how the baby who is born pink learns to become white. Recent research, mainly in the US, but also in Europe, shows that children recognize both the fact of difference and the inherent privilege in whiteness far earlier than is usually thought. In 1992, Troiner and Hatcher studied children in predominantly white primary schools in Britain. They found that race is a significant element in the lives of Black and white children, both in their social relationships and in their understanding of society. This is the case even where the Black children are in a small minority. In 2003, Phyllis Katz led a longitudinal study which followed 100 African American children and 100 European American children for their first 6 years. When the children were 3, they were shown photographs of other children and asked them to choose whom they would like to have as friends. Of the white group, 86% picked out other white children. When they were between 5 and 6, Katz gave these children a small deck of cards with drawings of people on them. Katz asked the children to sort the cards into 2 piles any way they wanted. Whereas only 16% split the piles on the basis of gender, 68% did so on the basis of race. Van Alsdale and Fegan studied 3 to 6-year-olds in an American urban nursery school using an observational research method. They found that children learnt to identify racial or ethnic markers such as skin colour and use them to gain social control, although such activities were curbed when adults were present. They write, children in this society learn at an early age that generally speaking, whiteness is privileged and darkness is not, and thus their choices in this regard are usually not surprising. Despite the fact that they only observed and recorded what occurred between children, Van Alsdale and Fegan experienced some hostility from white parents regarding their findings. They say, when most adults are confronted with evidence that their 3-year-olds are masters at managing racial ethnic relations, they often become disturbed, try to rationalize the evidence away, or dismiss our evidence as unique. They go on to say, this failure to acknowledge the importance of racial groups in children's lives arises from the twin adult convictions that children are naive and that colorblindness is not only desirable but achievable. Frankly put, many white adults insist that racial distinctions do not matter, while all around them children see ample and compelling evidence that they do matter, and matter very much indeed. One practical response to this ideological contradiction by white children is to conceal the creation of their own racial understandings and relationships, at least while the prying eyes of adults are on them. This enables them to reproduce the racial ethnic hierarchy in their own in relationships without interference from adults. The following is an example from Van Alsdale and Fegan's observational study in the daycare centre. In this instance, Renee, who is 4 and white, is pulling Ling Mai, 3 and Asian, and Jocelyn, who is 4.5 and also white, across the playground in a wagon. Renee tugs away enthusiastically, but the task is difficult. Pulling this heavy load across loose dirt is more than Renee can handle. Suddenly she drops the handle, which falls to the ground, and stands still, breathing heavily. Ling Mai, eager to continue this game, jumps from the wagon and picks up the handle. As Ling Mai begins to pull, Renee admonishes her. No, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her hips and frowns at Ling Mai. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task. This is the breaking point, and adult intervention is now sought. Ling Mai sobs loudly and runs to a nearby teacher, complaining that Renee hurt my feelings. We see the child's discretion at work. She offers no more than hurt feelings to explain her actions to the teacher. Since intervention is in order, the teacher approaches Rennie. "Did you hurt Ling Mai's feelings?" the teacher asks Rennie, who glumly nods assent. This is a familiar ritual. "I think you should apologize," the teacher continues, "because we are all friends here, and friends don't hurt each other's feelings." "Sorry," mutters Renee, and looking at Ling Mai, "I didn't do it on purpose." Ling Mai stands silently. The teacher waits for a few minutes and then finishes with, "Okay, can you guys be good friends now?" Both girls nod without looking at each other and quickly move away. The teacher stands and waits for a moment or two to ensure herself that the conflict does not erupt again, then moves off. Both Rennie and Ling Mai have already worked out that racial identity and colour have powerful implications in social relations, and both recognise that Rennie's words and actions are hurtful. However, both also seem to realise that the factor of race needs to be kept away from any involvement of an adult. Ling Mai did not reveal to the teacher that race was involved in the dispute, even though that would have got Rennie into a lot more trouble, and in one sense, Ling Mai would have triumphed. But she may well have enough experience of how white power operates to know that a temporary gain might not be worth longer-term punishment. Thus, while Rennie has to apologise, her position is not challenged. Indeed, is confirmed for them both. The common understanding of how children develop racism is that it is a bottom-up process, whereby the child notices physical differences between themselves and others, then hears derogatory comments about those who have a darker skin. Lawrence Hirschfield confronts this perception, positing instead that the process is more one that is top-down. He says, the young child does not learn about race in isolation, but in the more global task of parsing the social world. This consists of attending to information that is relevant to the scope of the social groups that exist in the world. He goes on to say, given all this, it makes sense that young children adopt a top-down approach to acquiring information about the prevailing social ontology, relying on a learning strategy that focuses attention on the logic of the system rather than worrying the details of individual identification. The child acquiring knowledge of race is in the business of acquiring knowledge of the kinds of things from which society is composed, not a catalogue of corporal variation. The child growing up in a white liberal family comes to recognise that they are white and that there are black others not so privileged, without necessarily being clear about what physical characteristics are pertinent to either category. They are socialised into a world of white solipsism, where, apart from the occasional exception, it is whites who are given the significant and interesting roles, whilst blacks are more often relegated to those of service, sport, music, or crime. Children need help to think about what they observe about the racist structures of society and to connect their inherited privilege with a developing concern for fairness. They need a language for thought from which effective action can be developed. However, many white adults become embarrassed, hush the child, ignore or distract them, or resort to the shortcut of colour blindness by insisting that everyone is the same and equal. Such an assertion is not only untrue and denies what the child has observed and experienced. By focusing on the universality of humans, the message is conveyed that it is the recognition of difference that is the cause of racism, rather than the fact that the child has been born into a social system that discriminates against certain groups, which they need help to acknowledge, understand, and begin to think through how they might respond. 4-year-old Rennie has already grasped that there are groups within society who have power and privilege, and that there are those who do not. She may not understand what the concepts white and American mean, but she does recognize that they can be used to exclude. She's incorporating whiteness as part of her identity and knows that this identity gives her power over the racial other. And most important, she acts on her understandings. The critical issue of group membership figures strongly in this incident. Rennie has also learned that this knowledge has to be kept secret from adults. When one knows something, and yet all the messages from important adults are that it shouldn't be known, the psyche has to repudiate some or all of the meaning of reality. Internally, two conflicting situations develop. In order that they can coexist, a vertical split is created within the psyche. The split is reflected in and reinforced by the wider social system, allowing both the reality of white privilege and its disavowal. In psychoanalytic theory, an internal conflict may lead to the creation of horizontal splits in the psyche, where aspects of the self are repressed, made unconscious and denied. Outside of conscious awareness, these repressed elements of the psyche can have a damaging and conflictual impact on the individual's life and relationships. While it's also a defensive process, disavowal develops within the ego when it is faced with two conflicting realities, causing a vertical split. Unlike repression, the individual remains conscious of both sides of the split, but will disavow either to meet internal desires and needs or minimize anxiety. Thus, I can know the reality of the consequences of my behavior, but will disregard that awareness in order to satisfy my desires, my omnipotence, and my narcissistic sense of entitlement. Disavowal features strongly in addiction, where the person is fully aware of the consequences of continuing their behavior, and their awareness that will be put aside and ignored in the service of meeting the need for the drug of choice. It can be seen operating collectively and in individuals in relation to the climate emergency. The liberal narrative, which exacerbated perhaps by the purity that is embedded in the very notion of whiteness, abjures the realities of racism, whilst also needing to maintain the privilege of the white skin. Thus, the white individual and the white collective has to maintain both white privilege and an acceptable perception of the self. The tension between these two positions is solved by disavowal. I suggest this vertical split as it relates to racism is not merely a single line dividing two parts of the psyche, with the investment of white privilege and the racist thought on one side, and the condemnation and rejection of racism on the other. On both sides, there remains a capacity for symbolization, which is lacking in certain moments when we are reminded of our racism. The internal psychic structure can be imagined as made up of two vertical layers, between which there is a gap, a silent, empty place, devoid of symbols, in which it is impossible to play or grieve. Adrian Harris states, it may be that there is in whiteness a psychose blanche, named by Andre Green for quite other purposes. Deeper than depression, deeper than rage, there is a blankness, a place where there is not sufficient structure for mourning, where the psyche gives way. Perhaps this is what whiteness is, the disruption or erasure of mourning, a gap in the psyche, which through whiteness functions like an imploding star, refusing signification. It is not trauma solely that is whitened out, but also destructiveness and memory. In most other aspects of her or his life, the white child in a modern liberal family can take their curiosity regarding the social milieu they seek to understand and find their place within to the significant adults in their life. The majority of the time, their experience will be of lively engagement, attention, and interest. When they raise the matter of differences concerning race and ethnicity, and they are responded to with the sterility of a blanket colorblind position, the lively, engaged presence they had known previously disappears, and they are faced with a blankness, a shutting down and a silencing. There is a deadness which relates to the subject, and the child quickly learns that the topic is not welcome for discussion. Their curiosity and developing concern for others, their preoccupations with the troubled matter of social fairness, is shut down, and the vertical split of disavowal develops within the psyche. Black parents will be far more alert to the fact of racism and the dominance of whiteness in the society in which their children are growing up, and will have to respond to and help reframe their children's experiences. White parents may feel they don't have to engage with the subject, and indeed may feel uncomfortable in doing so. Both the confidence and sense of entitlement comes with inhabiting a world which reflects you and your life, as well as a contract of silence about the disparities, is passed on from parent to child. Ryan Parker writes, a critical component of these processes of disavowal are the ways that white children learn to disconnect, to stop thinking, to stop noticing, to stop linking reality and history, and to turn off their empathic curiosity and care. If allowed to develop, this curiosity and care would cause problems for whiteness's power and the privileges it claims and protects, for it would result in recognition of reality, which eventually might lead to responsibility and reparation. A few years back, I was presenting a paper on racism to an all-white group of therapists. A difficult and uncomfortable discussion followed, in which the group seemed collectively engaged in finding ways to avoid the emotional work of exploring their own racism. These included individuals separating themselves from the white group by asserting a different nationality, language, history, class, or age. Questions were asked as to why we were not focusing on sexuality, gender, class, or disability. All important subjects, but not the topic for the day. As it always does, the introductions of these other inequalities managed to flatten the discussion, so the subject of racism was in danger of disappearing altogether. Someone pointed out that Black people are racist too, managing to evade the critical matter of power differentials. The hostility towards me as the person raising the subject was palpable. It was a depressing but very familiar event. After some time, a woman who'd been silent till then said she was thinking about an experience on her way to the seminar that day. She was waiting in her car at some traffic lights, and another car pulled up beside her, driven by a woman dressed in a burqa. Looking across, the thought came to her, oh, so they can drive, can they? She instantly pushed the thought away, and as she was aware of the racism behind it, but had been turning the memory over in her mind throughout the discussion. As someone who usually experienced no difficulty in speaking in groups, she was puzzled by what felt like a profound reluctance to bring this thought into the discussion. She recognized her own internal condemnation of the prejudice tied up in the thought, as well as a fear of external attack were she to give it voice. By recounting her thought to the group, who until then were firmly on the I am not a racist side of the vertical split, she articulated a reality from the other side. In my experience, three main possibilities were then open to the group. The first was to isolate and scapegoat the individual, so she carried alone all the guilt of having racist thoughts. The second was to normalize her response and wipe it clean of any racism, thus bringing her over to their side of the divide. The third, which fortunately was what happened in this particular group, was for her courage to give permission for others to recall similar instances in their own lives. The atmosphere shifted, the anxiety and the defensiveness became less intense, and the level of communication deepened. There emerged the chance of ownership of just a little of the destructiveness of our racism, allowing the possibility of grief. This dynamic played itself out in a group of individuals, but it might also be seen as an illustration of what occurs inside the psyche. Racist thoughts will arise in our minds, but they are likely to be quickly dismissed or even forgotten. This process of disavowal may mean we can preserve an internal sense of ourselves as good, but it perpetuates the ignorance that is such a central aspect of the maintenance of our white privilege and ensures nothing changes. As in the group, if the thought is surfaced and allowed, it becomes available for examination, and we deepen our understanding of how this social fact of whiteness affects and distorts our relationship to others in the world and to ourselves. Robin DiAngelo puts it thus: to increase the racial stamina that counters white fragility, we must reflect on the whole of our identities, and our racial group identity in particular. For white people, this means first struggling with what it means to be white. Adrienne Harris writes, "What is ironic and infuriating to many contemporary people of colour writing about racism is that the revelations and analysis of continuing racism by people of colour is not leading to work within the white community." I use the word work deliberately to mean the hard but necessary intellectual and emotional labour that will be essential to transform and unpack racism as it is lived and enacted among white persons. This is a way of suggesting that reparations, forgiveness, work across racial lines requires first work within white communities and individuals. Christina Sharp's 2016 powerfully moving book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, takes the three meanings of the word wake. 1, the track left on the water surface by a ship. 2, a watch or vigil held beside the body of someone who has died. And 3, the state of wakefulness, consciousness. Weaving in her personal history with film, photography and art, she uses these meanings as a contemplation of how Black people live with the aftermath of slavery and the racism of the modern world. She contemplates the wake that was created as the slave ship journeyed from Africa to the Americas, and the impunity with which enslaved Africans who were ill or weak or rebellious were thrown overboard. She expands the concept as a metaphor for the consideration of the suffering of Black people who lived their lives in the wake of the trade. Recovery requires deep mourning and what she calls wake work. Sharp, of course, is concerned with the disturbance that follows the centuries of slavery for Black people living today. But reading this impressive work, I found myself wondering if and how the concept might apply to whiteness. Our relationship to this painful history is very different, and so therefore is the work required. We who are descendants of the white people who sailed those ships, who invested in the trade, who profited from the trade and from colonialism, that is to say, all white people, need also to address our past. The whiteness of the waves created by the ships soon disappear. The waters close over the Black African bodies, the flat calm restored. For the white bystander, no permanent visible scar remains. The ships may have passed, but without justice, without reparation, without collective grieving and the eradication of racism, the trauma of those times continues to be held in the generations of Black descendants. White ancestral history, the role of the perpetrators, the impact on the victims, as well as the extent to which we profited and continue to profit, demands recognition. This history should be central to the curriculum taught to all our children, but for those of us whose education touched only lightly on the matter, it is our responsibility to educate ourselves now as adults. The second meaning of the term wake refers to its place in the process of mourning. We keep watch with the dead and grieve their passing. A wake is traditionally a collective activity which acknowledges that the death of one affects the whole. These are essential communal rituals, especially when a death is the result of a collective failure. For without them, the undigested, unmourned suffering of previous generations are passed down from generation to generation as phantom narratives that pervade our personal and social lives. For Black people who are the direct descendants of the enslaved, the grief is great. The idea that white people too need to mourn might seem odd, given that we've gained so much and apparently lost so little in the history of race. As we face the guilt of whiteness, past and present, we have to let go of the myth of our white innocence and purity and acknowledge the darkness at its heart. The privilege paid for by the blood of others has a toxicity at its root which corrupts the psyche. Terrible damage has been done and will continue to be done if we are to go on basing our economic and political ways of being on racist structures. Only by facing the pain and the guilt of the ancestors and of our inheritance, only by keeping vigil, can we become aware anywhere near to laying the iniquities of slavery to rest. This brings us to the third meaning of the term wake, which is to wake up to the way this world is structured and to our personal part in it. For white people, this means a lifelong process of active commitment to examine and confront both internal and external activities that are based in prejudice and stereotypes, which depersonalize and do harm to the Black other. It means listening with care when Black friends and colleagues tell us of their troubles, without rushing to a defense of ourselves. It requires us to face our white fragility head on, engage in conversations, even though we risk getting it wrong. And when we do, we need to listen openly to understand how our words have caused hurt. We need to develop our resilience and challenge our fragile state. It demands a careful attention to the thoughts and responses that arrive in the mind, because their exploration will help us see how the system of racism within which we live expresses itself in our mind. Because this system is based in our favor and privileges us, because part of that privilege is the invisibility of our whiteness, taking on this work requires us to make active, determined, and ongoing choices. The fragility in whiteness that maintains that privilege keeps pulling us away from the discomfort that is inevitable if we are to fully engage in that exploration. We are required to build a stamina and a resilience in speaking about the subject if we are to genuinely support anti-racist activities. As he was walking to his London studio one day in the 1960s, the Guyanese artist Frank Bowling came across a large white swan trapped in a pool of oil from which it was struggling to fly free. Struck by the ferocious determination of the bird, Bowling painted sufficient versions of the image to fill the first room with the retrospective of his work at Tate Britain. As I stood before the canvas in the summer of 2019, I was struck by this picture of whiteness, caught as it was by the consequences of exploitation of the planet and of people. I saw something within it Within it, something of the terrible damage done by whiteness since its inception in the 17th century, and its corruption of human relationships between each other and with the planet. I was honoured that Bowling agreed to let me use the image for the cover of my book. Having to bear continual acts of racism, both extreme and subtle, is what the Black individual has to suffer, and is the price they pay for my privilege. But it harms us all, and if I want to live in a world which is not divided, is not contaminated with the psychopathology of racism, where we re-find our connections, then I must acknowledge that this covenant of whiteness is my inheritance. Then I must decide what it means, what it costs, and whether I'm prepared to give it up. But I, for one, want my colour back.
Obrigado, Helen, pela sua apresentação. Extremamente interessante, pertinente para nós, brasileiros, para a nossa realidade. Acho que a gente vai ter um bom debate aqui. Bom, pessoal, obedecendo ao modo como a gente costuma fazer, quem quiser fazer pergunta. Bom, vamos começar então com a Carmen Lívia, tá? Lívia, contigo, querida.
Oi, Helen. Boa tarde. Em primeiro lugar, queria te agradecer muito, porque a tua obra foi o meu primeiro contato no meio junguiano com a questão racial e me despertou para o tema, né, dentro da psicologia analítica. Então, eu te agradeço muito, foi fundamental para mim. Queria te fazer duas perguntas, né? Primeiro, em ordem pessoal, o que é que te fez sair desse entorpecimento dos pactos narcísicos e te despertar para a questão racial? Essa é uma primeira. E a segunda, eu fico aqui pensando, né, que essas identidades que foram produzidas pelo colonialismo e pelo capitalismo, né, ela dividiu em corpos, né, algumas características não desejáveis, né? Mas não desejáveis para quem, eu fico aqui pensando, né? Porque fico pensando se isso que a gente deixou nos corpos pretos, que muitas vezes eram tidos como coisas contraproducentes para o capitalismo, se não seriam possibilidades existenciais desejáveis em alguma medida, né? Porque fico pensando, quando a gente deposita ali a hipersexualização, por exemplo, isso, né, num sentido de projeção junguiana, onde a gente pode projetar possibilidades existenciais, não seria interessante que a gente pudesse recuperar isso, de certa forma, e rever a sexualidade branca, como os brancos lidam com seus corpos, ou mesmo quando se taxa de preguiçoso, isso não poderia fazer a gente rever nossa relação com o tempo, com a aceleração que a gente vive, né? Tenho pensado coisas assim, e queria te ouvir.
I'd quite like to, is it possible to put it back to the group, really? Because it's, I mean, I think it's extremely important. It's right about the bodies, and it's certainly right about the sexualization No, is it possible? I'd like to hear what other people's response is to it, rather than just me answering a question. So.
Pessoal, então a Helen está convidando a que nós possamos comentar essa primeira colocação que a Lili fez, tá? Quem quiser se sentir à vontade para falar, por favor, tá bom?
Se ninguém quiser falar, posso dar um depoimento sobre essa questão? Claro. Eu não quero ocupar muito, então, só se alguém não quiser mesmo. O que me fez, né, despertar, sair desse entorpecimento, foi quando eu tive contato um pouco com a cultura banto. E ali vi uma outra forma de organizar, né, o viver, o amar, a sociedade. E aqui muito, porque eu me senti muito mais identificada com isso em alguns aspectos do que com a cultura branca. E fiquei pensando nisso, né? O quanto todos nós perdemos em termos de possibilidades existenciais. Só isso.
I think what I say, it would be good to hear from other people, but I think that's what I'm trying to say about the work we have to do is for us as well as for, it's not altruistic. It's actually, we are also suffering. Not in, I'm not trying to equate the suffering at all, but we have lost our color. We have lost a richness by being whitewashed.
Exatamente o meu ponto.
Vai, Lili.
Não, exatamente esse é o meu ponto.
Tá.
Não é o altruísta, né? Só.
Fazer uma questão que a gente discutiu aqui no Teaços com a Fanny Brewster, onde ela coloca uma questão que me parece a esse lugar de alteridade máxima, de alteridade absoluta, de outro, que o negro ocupa na cultura ocidental branca, né? Ela coloca algo muito interessante nesse sentido, né? De como a cultura preta, o homem preto, a mulher preta, esses personagens foram colocados e aprisionados numa categoria de outro, o outro absoluto, e como isso muitas vezes se coloca de uma maneira prejudicial, no sentido de não poder perceber o que há de efetivamente singular e particular nesses corpos, nessa cultura, nessa alma. Queria te ouvir um pouco sobre isso. Vou estender para uma outra questão, talvez um pouco mais biográfica, mas aonde foi que o tema do racismo e da branquitude, que é um tema também da sociedade britânica, da sociedade inglesa, mas aonde esse tema, para você, tornou-se um tema de pesquisa, tornou-se um tema de investigação, de estudo? Você consegue localizar isso?
Well, I think it was a series of events in my life when I came across, I came to realize how insulated I was, how I accepted a sort of norm that was my norm. Back in the 1970s, I traveled the hippie trail out east with some friends and met all sorts of cultures, and came to realize that my culture was just one of many. But there were also other points where I realized that just how ignorant I was, just how unknowing I was about my own self. And Fanny Brewster talks in her book about, she quotes Jung, that suggests that Black people can't individuate because then Jung says some terrible things about race, I have to say. But he says something about Black people can't individuate because they're missing a layer of the psyche. Now, I'm turning that on its head. I suggest that it's quite difficult for white people to individuate, actually, because we have this white ignorance. There's so much we don't know about ourselves. And that's what I've been on, is wanting to find out more about me and my whiteness, what that means.
Queria te fazer uma outra questão. Mudei a pergunta, vou fazer uma outra. Nós traduzimos um texto seu explorando o racismo, um exemplo clínico de um complexo cultural, onde tem você narra um caso que você atendeu e tem um ato falho bastante interessante entre whitewash e brainwash. Queria que você falasse um pouco, não exatamente desse caso, mas Como tem sido a sua clínica com pessoas negras? Quer dizer, isso é usual? Isso é muito raro no teu cotidiano? Como é que essa questão do racismo tem aparecido? Com mais evidência, menos evidente?
I'd quite like to turn the question round and ask people here what your experience is, particularly because my understanding of Brazil is you have an enormous variety of races. And you must, in your own practice, be working, well, are you only working with white people, or are you working across racial lines? And what does it mean? How does that work? I'd quite like to put the question back to you.
Martinha, quer pegar carona na pergunta e fazer a palavra girar?
Sim, tá. Primeiro, assim, obrigada aí pela, né? Acho que é um tema muito importante, né, Helen? Assim, muito interessante como você trouxe, né? E essa questão de circular, né? Assim, acho que o pensamento de todos. Assim, falando um pouquinho de mim, né, do que eu estou sentindo agora, assim, é interessante como esse tema é tão importante, mas eu acho que ele coloca a gente num lugar que não tem muita resposta, e nem assim, o que eu estou sentindo assim, tem várias coisas para falar, mas parece que elas ficam muito confusas. Eu acho muito interessante essa questão, né, da gente tirar esses véus, né? E eu fiquei pensando assim, não só na questão, assim, a questão das imagens, né? Como você trouxe sobre as crianças, não, como elas aprendem, né? Como a gente aprende aqui, né, no Brasil, mas acho que em todos os lugares, né? Dessa supremacia branca em que as imagens, né, muitas vezes estão colocadas para crianças, assim, em livros, dessas figuras muito brancas, né? Das rainhas, das princesas, e isso sempre continua aqui mesmo, né? Muitas vezes não é colocada, né, de outras cores. E eu fiquei pensando, né, que assim, muitas vezes as crianças elas podem ficar, né, tendo heróis aí, ou figuras que têm cores diversas, né? Não nem seja branco nem preto, verde, né? Você tem, por exemplo, o Hulk, alguém que vira verde, e essas cores se perdem só nessa, vamos dizer assim, nessa dicotomia, né? E até mesmo na religião, muitas vezes a imagem, né, de Jesus sempre veio muito um Jesus branco, de olhos azuis, quer dizer, tirando todo o contexto, né, desse nascimento. Então, acho que assim, é engraçado como traz essa estranheza, assim, uma necessidade muito grande de se falar sobre isso, mas, ao mesmo tempo, sem muitas bases. É como, assim, pelo menos é assim que eu estou me sentindo, assim, meio perdida, sem até conseguir elaborar mesmo uma pergunta. Não, acho que assim, essas estão... Não sei o que as pessoas estão pensando, não sei se fiquei claro.
Eu pegando carona no que a minha xará está falando...
Sem H.
Sem H. Eu acho, Ellen, que para nós é uma questão muito complexa, porque nós somos frutos da mistura. Por exemplo, você olha para mim, você não acredita que eu tenho um avô negro. Né? Você olha para mim, você não acredita que eu tenho, de um lado, um alemão, um italiano, um português e um avô negro. Então, assim, eu acho que no nosso país, essa dor ainda não foi tocada com a devida responsabilidade, né? Então, eu fiquei, com as questões que você trouxe, eu fiquei muito pensando isso, né? Como que as nossas crianças, que são pardas, nós somos 51% não branco no nosso país, né? E como é que essa identidade está sendo gestada, né? Eu posso te falar que eu fiz 30 anos de análise para conseguir algum tipo de equilíbrio psicológico com essas forças dentro de mim, né? Tão contraditórias. Então, eu acho que vem um silenciamento muito grande, gente. Eu também sinto isso ainda, né? Como falar disso, né? Como falar de provavelmente um avô abusador, né? Um avô que era feitor de escravo e do outro lado um escravo. Eu acho que é difícil para nós. A gente precisa falar disso, mas acho que a gente ainda não sabe nem por onde começar. É como eu sinto, entendeu?
Alguém mais quer fazer a palavra circular, dar um depoimento? Eu acho que a Helen está pedindo para a gente é que o nosso encontro seja menos um encontro formal, perguntas e respostas, e mais um espaço de troca de experiências, particularmente para que a gente possa apresentar para ela um tanto quanto da nossa realidade brasileira, de como é que a gente vê essa questão dentro da nossa prática, do nosso cotidiano. Alguém mais quer dar um depoimento, comentar?
Eu gostaria, Marcos.
Oi, Thaisa, por favor.
Muito também tocada pelo que a Marta está provocando, né? Acho que eu fico também muito tomada por esses afetos, essa questão do embranquecimento, né? Eu sou nordestina e acho que isso toca muito, né? Faz a pele vibrar num outro ritmo. Essa questão, de fato, Marta, é muito silenciada mesmo, né? Eu também, assim como você, tenho uma história. Aqui tenho um lado da família, né? Português, espanhol, um outro lado que vem de uma escravidão, né? Vinda, a força vinda, e negada, e não dita. Há poucos anos, depois de muito questionamento, de perguntas, porque tinha um pedaço da história que não se contava, que a gente não sabia, né? A minha geração, por exemplo, não sabia, e a partir dessas, né, dessa busca, dessas perguntas, minhas primas, e enfim, né, essa geração agora, que tem buscado o que está nesses hiatos. E aí, o que está nesses hiatos, né? Acho que tem muito desse processo de embranquecimento. Não conta essa história para não marcar de preto, né? Para não manchar o branco, né? Então, isso é muito forte, sim, muito forte. Isso é muito recente na nossa história e precisa. Acho que as palavras a gente vai buscando as palavras, eu estou aqui sentindo isso, assim, né? Deixando, inclusive, essa afetação no corpo, assim, buscando palavras e refazendo essas narrativas para trazer a multiplicidade dessa história, sabe? Que parece que se você dança e você ri, não faz isso que você vai mostrar, né? Que tem outras cores aí. Então, assim, compartilhando um pouco dessa afetação com vocês.
Oi, gente, boa tarde. Bom, fazendo aí, acho legal também essa ideia de fazer a palavra circular, vou trazer aqui também meu depoimento. Em alguns, né, por alguns lugares que eu circulo, eu como mãe vejo que hoje em dia já tem aqui um movimento nas escolas de trazer muitos autores negros. Eu acho que existe até algo em lei já, e eu acho que como a gente está fazendo aqui, né, o que a gente tem que fazer é isso, é fazer a palavra circular e sair desse lugar, né, de que os brancos têm sempre a palavra e são sempre, né, a palavra hegemônica e que predomina no mundo. Eu acho que ainda é muito pouco, porque como estou falando aqui como mãe, por exemplo, eu vejo que nas escolas já é trazido muita literatura negra e essa temática para as discussões com as crianças, mas a gente ainda vê muito pouca presença negra entre alunos, entre, né, os docentes também. E eu também sou estudante, né, faço faculdade de psicologia, e a gente também tem esse movimento muito bonito na faculdade de trazer novos autores. Ainda é uma coisa um pouco oficial, assim, a gente, até os próprios alunos brigam por trazer outros autores. Alguns professores mais pontualmente trazem autores negros, né, brasileiros, que estão fazendo produções mais recentes na psicologia, porque a gente vive realmente muito nessa hegemonia de autores brancos, né, europeus e até mais homens, até, né? E é isso, tem muitos indígenas também aqui no Brasil, acho, produzindo saberes muito interessantes, e isso está, né, acho que a gente está se abrindo muito para isso, apesar de ser um movimento lento e ainda né, pequeno, perto do que a gente, né, onde a gente tem que chegar, mas eu acho que cabe a gente, né, que a gente acho que quase todo mundo que está de câmera aberta, todo mundo que está de câmera aberta é branco, em busca disso, sabe? A gente fazer como a Helen está fazendo aqui lindamente, fazer circular essa palavra e em busca e procurar esses autores e trazer eles para a cena, e realmente tem muita coisa interessante sendo feita por aí. Eu acho que o racismo faz parte até de uma coisa muito maior, que é uma ética colonial, né, que a gente vive, que para o nosso ser bom a gente tem que desmerecer os outros, né, essa monocultura de pensamento, que eu acho que como junguianos aqui não faz nenhum sentido, né, a gente vive, né, da multiplicidade, e acho que é isso, cabe a gente estar sempre em busca de como colocar isso em prática, né, e fazer essa palavra circular em todos os lugares.
Legal, Cláudia. Helen, você quer comentar algo? A gente continua falando, depois você... O que você sugere?
No, I mean, the only thing I'd like to say is this point about how difficult it is to talk about this subject. It's one of the things that got me very interested as to why. Why do we find it so hard to talk to each other about race and racism? I think it's a very important question. But I'm happy. There's someone else who's got their hand up, so I'm happy to.
Gui, vamos lá? Gui, está muito baixo. Vocês estão ouvindo? Está baixo, Gui?
Tá o fone, então.
Aí. Tá bom, agora tá bom, vai.
O microfone está com problema aqui. Agora tá bom, né? Agradecer a Helen e o Marcos, a Luciana, mais uma vez, né, pela importância aí da discussão. Bom, na verdade é um pequeno comentário e uma questão relativamente simples, mas eu queria saber um pouco dela a respeito da experiência no Reino Unido, né? Assim, eu estive, né, no Reino Unido por um ano, né? Morei por um ano. Evidentemente que não foi o suficiente para ter uma experiência profunda de perceber a questão das relações raciais, né, no país, no caso na Inglaterra, mas eu não sei, eu queria só pontuar, não sei até que ponto a Helen sabe da violência, né, das relações raciais no Brasil, porque eu sou bastante sensível ao tema, né? Eu e outros colegas aqui, né, pesquisamos isso há algum tempo, e eu acho importante dizer, caso ela não saiba, né, não sei o quanto ela conhece, que o Brasil é um dos países mais profundamente racistas que existem no mundo, né? E é uma violência extrema, né? No sentido de que a população negra, em geral, é muito marginalizada, né? No meu entender, muito mais do que na Inglaterra, mas infinitamente mais. O meio psicanalítico, em geral, né, incluindo, obviamente, os junguianos, né, é um meio bastante branco. O meio junguiano, particularmente, a gente virtualmente não tem negros, né, com poucas exceções, que daria para contar nos dedos, eu acho, né? Então, a história do país, isso obviamente que ela sabe, né, por conta da escravidão e tantas outras coisas, nos levou a esse estado de coisas, mas diferentemente, por exemplo, dos Estados Unidos, né, as ações afirmativas ainda ainda engatinham aqui, né? Então é uma problemática extremamente sensível para nós. O que eu queria saber basicamente é qual é a participação de analistas não brancos, né, no meio da psicanálise no Reino Unido, né, se tem um número expressivo, se esse debate é frequentemente colocado, e a questão de pessoas, por exemplo, pessoas pretas procurarem psicoterapeutas pretos, que é uma discussão que tem sido feita aqui, né? E se isso acontece lá, como é que ela enxerga isso, né? Enfim, acho que é isso. Não sei se ficou claro, mas eu queria um pouco, enfim, dar esse depoimento e saber isso dela, se possível.
Helen, você quer responder? Temos mais uma pessoa para comentar. O que você...
Well, I can just... I'm very aware as you're talking that I've given some talks in America, in the US, and I'm very aware that we have in the UK a colonial, ex-colonial relationship with the United States, whereas your colonial relationship, of course, is with Portugal. And I know something about the British relationship to our colonial past, which is where there's a lot of denial, a huge amount of denial, particularly at the moment with our very far right, with our right-wing government. I just want to say about the training issue. I think we've got a huge amount of work to do in the Jungian community if we're really wanting to become a much more diverse, representative community. And it means doing as Jungians, I think it means doing an awful lot of work around our texts, particularly Jung's writings. In my own organization, we've been working for some years now with small groups working away at certain Jungian texts. There are some words we use, like the word primitive, which is very, 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 very suspect. Its roots are in the old Victorian 19th century anthropologists. We need to do much more thinking about what our concepts are, where they come from. I don't mean we throw Jung out altogether, but we do have to really look at what he's saying about some of the so-called primitives. It's true of what he says about women and perhaps to a lesser extent, but to some extent about sexuality. And we've been doing a lot of work in small groups, looking at texts and thinking about them. And we've just devised, which starts tomorrow actually, a new training, which is based on really trying to think about our analytic work in a social and political context. But I suggest there's a lot of work involved to move from a position where we are a very white profession to one where we might represent the diversity of our country. And I think it's white people who have to do the work on this. I'm not sure I can say much more than that, but the work of whiteness is an ongoing, long-term, life-term commitment, and it's hard, and we don't have to do it. But Martha wants to say something.
Eu achei tão interessante, né, a coragem que você teve de abrir mão do privilégio da palavra, né? Você, não, quero ouvir as pessoas, fazer a palavra circular, né? Achei muito corajoso e acho que talvez seja resultado desse trabalho de desconstrução dos privilégios de raça branca, né? Que tem o direito da fala, né? E recusar esse jeito de estar. Achei muito legal, Helen, gostei.
Helen, deixa eu te colocar uma curiosidade. Dentro do campo junguiano, essa questão do racismo, ela está muito explícita na sua obra, né? E da Fanny. A gente poderia pensar no Samuel Kimbles, mas acho que ele vai mais pela noção do complexo cultural. Mas a minha pergunta, o fato de serem duas mulheres a escrever sobre o tema do racismo, é acaso? É aleatório? Ou você acha que a própria posição feminina permite um olhar diferente? O que é que são as mulheres no campo junguiano que estão escrevendo sobre isso? E aqui no Brasil também. Lili, Guilherme, enfim.
What do you think? It sounds like
não sei, eu acho que não é ocasional, eu acho que não... rapidamente a gente poderia pensar como alguma coisa aleatória. A minha pergunta, estou pensando aqui em voz alta junto a você, é que a própria posição da mulher na cultura oferece a ela uma sensibilidade maior que a posição dos homens. Quer dizer, as mulheres... 1000 aspas no que eu vou falar, por favor. Mas as mulheres são mais sensíveis a essas questões do racismo, da discriminação, do que propriamente os homens e os seus discursos?
Da própria opressão, né?
Da própria opressão? Uhum.
Eu iria por essa linha, Marcos. Eu acho que as mulheres têm menos privilégios, apesar de serem mulheres brancas, né? O ápice é o homem. A mulher branca... né?
Perfeito, menos privilégios, ótimo.
Menos privilégios, né?
Cris, Viana, o que você acha?
I think
Eu lembro a Angela Davis, né? Gênero, raça e classe.
Sorry, what did you say? Chris.
Hello?
Cris, ela quer te ouvir.
Obrigada. Angela Davis, né? Gênero, raça e classe. Um informa o outro, né?
E antes dela, a Safiotti no Brasil, né? Com a questão dos nós.
Então, a gente tem inclusive, aqui no Brasil, a gente tem uma escritora, Lélia Gonzalez, que também é, inclusive, admirada pela Angela Davis, né? Pelo trabalho que ela fez enquanto feminista e enquanto mulher negra.
Por que as mulheres estão à frente disso?
I would offer some word of caution, having now had three. We've got our latest female prime minister, who is terrible, who is very very destructive, and we had Margaret Thatcher, who was also very damaging to this country, I think. So I don't think just because you're a woman makes you okay. But I think there is something about, I know, for example, when I was training and I read Jung writing about women and the animus, and I hated it. I couldn't bear it. I had to sort of put it up to one side so I could get on with thinking about the rest of Jung. And I'm now quite shocked that I didn't see the racism. I did see the sexism. I didn't see the racism in Jung when I was training. So I think there is something that there's something that women have through experience of being second-class citizens, of being oppressed, of being powerless, which is important. And I know it was important between me and Fanny when we wrote the book together. Although I have to say it was a very, very, very difficult project, actually. It was not easy. And it got more and more difficult as we went on. But just because there is a woman in power, my experience from Britain is women in power not necessarily a good thing. I don't know whether you know our new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, but she's doing terrible things to our country at the moment.
Posso, Marcos?
Claro, Cris, contigo.
Não, no Brasil isso é muito claro para o movimento feminista, né? Porque nem sempre as mulheres estão ao lado das mulheres, né? Então, a gente não está às vésperas de um processo de votação, então para nós é muito claro, né? Além de estar nesse processo de votar em mulheres feministas, né? Ou seja, que vão defender os direitos das mulheres e vão estar ao lado das mulheres. A gente diz aqui no Brasil que uma puxa a outra, né? Que além de estarem ao lado das mulheres, vão fomentar que outras mulheres também participem dos espaços de poder. Uma coisa, complementando aqui o que o Guilherme falou, além de ser um dos países mais racistas do mundo, a gente também é um dos países com maior número de feminicídios, e principalmente de transfeminicídios, né? Então, é muito complexo isso, né, no nosso país. Então, a gente vê, né, enquanto mãe, né, fico muito sensibilizada com as mulheres aqui da favela que perdem seus filhos nessa luta insana contra o tráfico de drogas, que a gente sabe que também é uma face muito triste do racismo, né? Hoje não temos navios negreiros, mas temos prisões cheias de principalmente homens negros e também aumentando assustadoramente o número de mulheres negras encarceradas, né?
Eu acho também, gente, que essa coisa da mulher... Acho que não sei se existe a mulher, né? Quer dizer, uma mulher que chega no poder, usando o exemplo na Inglaterra, né, da Charter, ou mesmo dessa que está atual, será que ela está ligada aos valores do que seria o feminino arquetípico? Ou ela foi capturada pelo complexo, né, masculino e está defendendo, sem perceber, os valores da manutenção, né, da sociedade? Então, eu acho que tem que olhar para saber qual é a mulher, como é que a mulher vai. Aqui no Brasil, nós estamos tendo um movimento muito legal de eleições coletivas. Então, assim, várias mulheres vão juntas tentar conquistar o parlamento aqui, que seria o nosso parlamento. Ou seja, explica um pouco sobre isso, Cris. São coisas que eu estou achando bárbaro isso.
Candidaturas coletivas, porque aqui no Brasil você precisa se candidatar a partir de um partido e a partir de um nome. Mas o que está acontecendo é que algumas candidaturas estão reunindo mulheres para pleitear um único cara.
E aí é um coletivo que vai estar junto. Então, é outra forma de estar no poder. Eu acho que a gente tem que sempre olhar como é que essa mulher chegou lá. Né? Eu gosto muito de... Mesmo aqui em São Paulo, que é a diferença entre a Marta Suplicy e a Irondina. Como é que cada uma chegou lá e o que cada uma fez quando chegou lá. né? Uma defendeu os valores de classe dela, óbvio, né? E a outra está até hoje lutando. Né? Então, eu acho que depende de como é que a mulher chega, né? Como é que ela chega? Que valores, de fato, ela carrega dentro dela, né?
Anderson, quer comentar alguma coisa?
Desculpe. Professora?
Can I just say one thing that before you do, Anderson, sorry, just to say that I think there's certainly in this country been huge, and in America, huge conflicts between the white feminist movement, and there's been a lot of challenge to it by the black feminists. So I think it's a very complex issue, this. It's not sort of women okay. There's a big race issue in feminism, I think. But sorry, Anderson, you were going to speak.
Obrigado, professor. Boa tarde, grupo. Só um breve comentário. No momento, eu faço uma pesquisa que entrevista profissionais negras, né, terapeutas negras, trabalhando com a branquitude. Então, me interessa entender nesse atravessamento o tanto de violência que acontece, violências estruturais, né, não são violências, às vezes, intencionais, e às vezes são, a pesquisa tem mostrado isso, mas e aí eu tenho conversado com mulheres negras e as pessoas estão destroçadas, assim, por coisas que elas ouvem nas clínicas e não são necessariamente intencionais, né? Por exemplo, imaginar uma terapeuta negra ouvindo sobre uma mãe negra que perdeu um filho para violência policial. Da pessoa não conseguir sustentar a análise e sair e chorar, porque, pelo medo de perder o próprio filho, num exemplo, né? Então, era só para colocar assim que eu tenho também olhado para isso, tentado entender aí. E eu tenho cada vez percebido mais que pesquisar sobre a contratransferência de analistas negros no atendimento a pessoas brancas tem se tornado um trabalho sobre branquitude. Era só para colocar e trazer.
Alguém mais quer falar alguma coisa? Sandra Flores?
Olá, sim, também quero colocar alguns questionamentos aqui, algumas provocações, né? Eu fiquei pensando, né, por que aqui no Brasil, né, que é a nossa realidade, tem poucas pessoas, né, nos nossos consultórios negros. As poucas experiências que eu tive de pacientes negros são pessoas assim que chegam bastante desconfiadas, né? Custam, né, a se abrir, a realmente entrar no processo, para até assim como uma forma de, vamos dizer, assuntar, né, de pesquisar se ele não vai ser rechaçado também nesse processo, né? Qual que é a minha ideologia, se eu tenho preconceito ou não. E a outra questão no Brasil que eu gostaria de colocar é que não é só a questão de pele, né? Que envolve os preconceitos e tal. Também a questão de cultura e religião, né? Por exemplo, as religiões de cultura africana, como o candomblé, eles também, a gente também sente, né, um grande preconceito. Então, essas duas questões que eu sinto e gostaria de compartilhar com vocês.
Can I then respond a little? But I think to Anderson's point as well. I'm not quite sure I completely understood you, Anderson. So you need to check to say. I think when a Black person meets a white therapist, there is going to be racism. That's just a reality. In the paper that Marcus mentioned, it wasn't just the patient had the idea of the whitewash as opposed to the brainwash. I also had the thought, cuckoo in the nest, which was, I knew was a racist thought. I didn't want this Black woman in my consulting room, somewhere at a very primal level. I wasn't proud of it. I was very ashamed of it, in fact, but I knew it was racist. And we cannot live as white people in this society and not have racist thoughts. They will occur in our minds. What I'm suggesting is, let's look at those. Let's examine them like we do everything else. Not, oh, bad me, I shouldn't have that thought, but just, that's interesting. What's happening here? And can we explore it? As analysts, we have to do some of that exploration in our own minds, because it's not our patient's problem. And some of it we might know to do with our patients. But we walk into that consulting room from a racist society. We bring it into the consulting room. We cannot do anything else. If we just deny it and say, I am not a racist, therefore it's fine, then we're letting our Black patients down. We have to know that there is racism in the room. Whenever a Black person and a white person meet, there is racism, and that's true in the consulting room. It doesn't mean we can't work with it, but we can't. But just denying it in our own minds, we're doing it for ourselves, I think. White people are often much more worried about being seen as racist than worried about what harm we might be doing to other people. It's our own narcissism, in a way, that we're worried about. Does that make sense? Yeah, go on, Anderson. I'm not sure.
Fechado, Anderson.
Sim. Não, professor, sim, faz sentido. É que na minha pesquisa, eu sugiro o caminho inverso, do analista negro recebendo um paciente branco que toma ações racistas, né? Então, como isso é complexo no lugar do analista, ou como que o analista vai lidar realmente, né, na dinâmica, é claro que não tem uma forma só, mas realmente frente a todas as violências, né? A minha experiência sai de naquele 2018, nas eleições de Bolsonaro aqui no Brasil, uma paciente levantar e ser extremamente racista, ser muito violenta, né? Então, minha pesquisa ela sai desse momento. Então, eu sugiro só o caminho oposto, que é um outro problema, onde o analista vai flertar também com silenciamentos, com coisas que ele pode falar, não pode falar. Então, mas eu acho que a senhora compreendeu sim. Era sobre isso que eu estou conversando. Muito obrigado.
Marta,
I agree with that, and there are Black analysts who've written about this experience. They know they will have to deal with the violence. There are white patients who come to work with a Black therapist will be not overtly racist, or they wouldn't go and work with a Black person, but it will emerge. And that's, in my book, I write a bit about a case in the chapter on supervision, where the white supervisor can help the Black therapist by identifying with the white patient's racism, to help the Black not to collude with it. I mean, identify with that, recognizing what the patient is bringing, and helping the Black therapist manage that work. because it's very hard for a Black therapist to be working all the time with that violence. But I absolutely agree. But it's our Black colleagues have a hard time, and they do too with their Black patients sometimes. Often for the Black patient, they've got a second-rate therapist somewhere inside them. The internalized racism means that really white is good and black is second-rate. So although even when Black patients seek out a Black therapist, there is unconsciously a hatred of that Black patient, of that Black therapist, which is an identification, can be an identification with their own internalized racism. It's a very complicated thing. I mean, I take my hat off to Black therapists. I think they hold a lot.
Helen, a gente está finalizando o nosso encontro, né? Passou muito rápido, 2 horas. Queria fazer 2 últimas questões para você. A rainha morreu. E a Inglaterra tem um histórico não muito nobre na relação com as suas colônias. O que acontece? O que acontece no inconsciente cultural britânico quando a rainha morre? Eu estou me lembrando de quando a princesa Diana morreu, um grupo de junguianos escreveu um livro, Quando uma Princesa Morre. O que a gente pode pensar da morte da rainha? O que morre junto com ela? Ou se não morre nada, tudo continua na mesma?
Oh dear, oh dear. A friend of mine emailed me. We've had a terrible couple of weeks here. It's just been, the country's gone mad, and there has been, the thought police have been around. Any Republican thought is terrible. And a friend emailed me on the day of the funeral saying, one day we will get off our knees. So there is something about, in this country, which is an acceptance of, I don't know whether you've watched the funeral at all, but all that pomp and circumstance, the historic, oh dear. We're trapped in this country, I think, in something too old and too unchallengeable. Our slave history at the moment particularly is, there's a big war going on here at the moment about the anti-woke. In somewhere in our collective view, we ended slavery with William Wilberforce. We forget the 300 years of being the main slave trader in the world. It's a big battle going on at the moment for our history, and therefore for our future. And I suspect Brazil's having a very, very different, but in a way, very important battle for your own history and your own future. But if we don't take on our history, I don't know how we have a future, really.
Você me deu a brecha para fazer a última pergunta. Domingo nós teremos, sem dúvida, as eleições mais importantes da história da República do Brasil. Entre a continuação do governo de extrema-direita... No mundo. Entre a continuação do governo de extrema-direita do Bolsonaro e uma proposta progressista, renovadora, social, representada pelo Lula. Você tem alguma palavra para nos dizer sobre isso? Algo que você possa nos apoiar ou nos dar alguma coisa a dizer? Uma boa sorte, um conselho, uma oração, uma canção.
Oh, I do.
Nós estamos precisando muito.
We're behind. All I can say is there's awful things happening in the world, and Bolsonaro's someone, I don't know. He has to be stopped, doesn't he? There's something, but there's also something about what Brazil. I always remember the talk about South Africa. I mean, it's a different subject, I know, but what South Africa held for the world, in the world shadow somewhere. And I think there's something that Brazil has held for the world in terms of the shadow around climate. Something about the Amazon and, you know, the lungs of the world, and a sort of deliberate attack on it that we've all been so frightened about, really, and the way that one man, well, it has to be more than one man, doesn't it? But yeah, it's can repair happen? Can something change, move forward? Does it have to be destruction? But I don't know. I mean, it's your politics. I can't. We've got enough problems with our own at the moment. But I know. We're all holding our breath, quite literally here, to see what happens in Brazil. Feels so important. What do you think is going to happen? What is the view there?
A minha visão é que a gente está num momento absolutamente crucial, decisivo, dos rumos desse país. Uma continuidade do governo Bolsonaro seria uma espécie de declaração de uma falência civilizatória no Brasil. E aqui a gente tem feito, de muitas maneiras diferentes, um trabalho de resistência, um trabalho a favor da vida, de não deixar que essa pulsão de morte chamada Bolsonaro tome conta da nossa alma, por assim dizer. É um trabalho de resistência, de muita luta, mas a gente vai vencer. A gente vai vencer. Helen, queria te agradecer pelo teu apoio. Torça pela gente. Domingo eu mando notícias para você e espero que a gente possa ter um novo encontro em breve, em condições políticas mais favoráveis, mais libertas, progressivas, eróticas. Vai ser um grande prazer te receber. Obrigado por você ter participado e aceito o nosso convite.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. It's been really interesting for me and just good luck on Sunday. I wish you well.
Obrigado, Helen. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença.
Ok.
Nós voltamos a Luz Ximenes é que sabe as datas.
Acho 28 de outubro.
Olha, Luciana Ximenes.
Já sabia que você ia precisar de mim nesse momento. 28 de outubro, às 16, com as fantasias de Jung sobre a África e a cura da psicologia analítica na África, com Roger Brook.
Continuamos mais ou menos no mesmo tema. Então, temos aí um intervalozinho um pouco maior. Boa votação. Vamos torcer, dar as mãos, vamos ver se domingo esse pesadelo termina e a gente inaugura A gente vai ter um imenso trabalho quando o Bolsonaro sair, que é reconstruir, reinventar, reimaginar esse país. Boa sorte para a gente, vamos arregaçar as mangas e vamos vencer. Beijos em
Todos
todos.
os deuses te ouçam, Marcos. A todos.
Beijo, pessoal. Até lá.